I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming. Professor Stephanie Shador will introduce our speaker, but I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge our sponsors. This event is sponsored by the Psychology Department, but with very generous co-sponsorship from the Peace and Conflict Studies Concentration and also from the Kraft Hyatt Fund for Christian Jewish Relations. And I'd just like to also mention, too, that part of what occasioned our decision to invite Professor Staub to speak on campus is we have a number of psychology courses this semester that in some way relate either directly to the Holocaust or covering topics that might inform an understanding of the Holocaust. Professor Bertrand's seminar on science, medicine, and the Holocaust, Professor Freeman's course on the psychology of good and evil, Professor Shador's social psychology class, and also Professor Lipsitz's adult psychopathology. Professor Bertrand and Professor Lipsitz have had the opportunity to study at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and that was also supported by the Kraft Hyatt Fund, and we're very grateful what those faculty have learned in their time studying at Yad Vashem has actually come back and enriched our curriculum and allowed us to kind of add an element to Holocaust education to our courses. And Professor Staub's visit in a way kind of supports that and gives the students in those courses an opportunity to hear an expert in that area speaking on those topics. So I introduce Professor Shador. She'll say a little bit more about our speaker, and thank you for coming.
Well, welcome. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Ervin Staub, who comes to us as an emeritus faculty member at UMass Amherst. He's been on faculty there for a number of years, and he's also the founding director of its Ph.D. concentration in the psychology of peace and violence. Dr. Staub was born in Hungary and came to the U.S. to complete his undergraduate education at the University of Minnesota, and he later went on to complete his Ph.D. in psychology at Stanford University. Dr. Staub is an internationally recognized expert in the study of bystanders and perpetrators in contexts of violence. And his work is also focused on how violence between groups can be prevented and reconciliation can be promoted. During his distinguished career, he's been quite an active scholar, authoring 10 books and well over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles. I have to admit, I stopped counting at 100 as I was working my way through your CV. So he has spent quite a bit of time examining these issues both inside the laboratory and outside of the laboratory. And perhaps most noteworthy, much of Dr. Staub's career has been spent taking his findings from laboratory settings and implementing them into contexts where these findings can have the most impact. So for example, he helped to develop a training program for the state of California after the Rodney King incident to reduce the use of unnecessary force by police. He also helped to craft a project in New Orleans to promote healing and reconciliation in post-Katrina New Orleans. And more recently has contributed to developing a radio program to facilitate reconciliation in war-torn Rwanda. His scholarly contributions and work to reduce violence around the world have earned Dr. Staub recognition from a variety of professional organizations, including being named the recipient of the Lifetime Contributions to Peace Psychology Award of the Society for Peace, Conflict, and Violence from the American Psychological Association in 2002. So it's my great pleasure and it's our distinct honor to welcome Dr. Staub, who will be talking to us about the passivity of bystanders in genocide and mass killing and generating active bystandership. So welcome, Dr. Staub.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Although I always feel a little funny when I talk about genocide and I say it's a pleasure to be here with you. It would be an even greater pleasure if there was no genocide, and so I wouldn't be here with you. I have studied what leads people to help others and what leads people to remain passive bystanders when they see terrible things happening to people, what leads individuals and nations to be passive bystanders. I have been very concerned with how we can generate active bystandership so that people will respond when something happens that they are witness to, and also how we can get groups and nations involved in active bystandership. So I'm going to talk about these things today in some depth. In the course of that, I will say things that indicate what are some of the sources of genocide, because it's in that context that I will look at active bystandership. So what is a bystander? I define a bystander as someone, an individual, or a collection of individuals who is in a position to know that something is happening that requires action and is in a position to take action. Passive bystanders will not take action under those circumstances. Active bystanders, I think of as people who take positive action. So if a kid in a school harasses another kid and somebody else stands by and watches it and then joins the person who harasses that kid, that's not the kind of active bystandership I'm talking about. When I talk about active bystandership, I'm talking about people taking positive action. Now, it's obvious that we are bystanders, witnesses, bystanders to an incredible range of events. Things that happen here at home, child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, the poverty and hunger of many people, sexual trafficking, injustice of many kinds, and we are witnesses to things that happen in the outside world. And sometimes we are witnesses only to the extent that there is a little piece of information that we are exposed to somewhere. Just an article hidden in a newspaper, or you watch television about something else and there is some little thing comes up on the bottom of your screen that says something about some event happening at other places where people are harmed. So the information that we may get is minimal. Now the question is, what do we do when we are exposed to a limited extent or even to a large extent? When I was at Harvard, in my first job, I did a study where I had Harvard students collapse on a quiet Cambridge street, either holding their knee or holding their heart as they collapsed, when somebody approaching was about 50 yards away. And there were many variations in this study. But what was very striking to me and very important as a phenomenon is that some people were approaching, they had a single glance at this person who was collapsing or collapsed, turned away, never looked back, and some of these people at the next corner turned off the street and walked away. There were other people who, after a single glance, immediately rushed over, and still others who did various other things. But the point is that some of us, and often many of us, and countries also, sometimes when they have limited information about something, we turn away, we don't take in what's happening in order, I assume, to avoid the feeling of responsibility that we would have if we actually process the information in front of us. Now, the thing is that bystanders have great potential power. Even single individuals can create societal processes or exert influence that bring about important change. How many of you know who is Joe Darby? Joe Darby was a soldier who was at Abu Ghraib. And when the inmates at Abu Ghraib were abused in various ways, he happened to be on leave. And he came back, and somebody showed him all the photos and more that we later saw. Now, I don't know how many of you remember these. It was some years ago, and you were much younger, but there were these photos of all kinds of different kinds of abusive behavior towards inmates at Abu Ghraib. So he wrestled with his conscience. He had actually a disc with these photos, and he decided to do something with it. And at first, because he knew what could be the potential consequences to him, he just slipped this disc under the door of a superior officer. And later he came forward to acknowledge that he was the one who did this. And active bystandership requires moral courage. It requires that we act on our moral values or our empathy and caring in spite of potential negative consequences to us. And his fellow soldiers did not like that he did this. But it had important consequences, making us aware and making it less likely that not only at Abu Ghraib, but a whole variety of other American prisons with Iraqi prisoners, where some similar kinds of things were taking place, it made it less likely that they will continue. Ron Ridenour, a soldier in Vietnam, not at My Lai or My Lai. How many of you know what happened at My Lai? American troops fighting the enemy, the Viet Cong, were approaching a village where they believed there would be Viet Cong, but there were no Viet Cong. They weren't shot at. And our soldiers killed something like 350 to 500 children, women, and old men for no reason. And Ron Ridenour, who wasn't there, but who trained with some of these soldiers who were there and learned about this, decided that the American people need to do about this. And he went and investigated further. He went home and talked to his family, and his family told him, it's not your business. Don't do anything. But he went ahead. He wrote letters to many people, and he didn't rest until his letters brought result. That somebody in Congress began to investigate, and a journalist wrote an article in the New York Times, and the whole thing broke open. But often, in order to make a difference, people need to join together, and people can join together. The apartheid in South Africa was ended as a result of many different kinds of actions. But one kind of action was outsiders, students, workers, other people begin to demonstrate against apartheid and began to demonstrate to influence corporations not to do business in South Africa. And South Africa had a vibrant business community, and the corporations stopping to do business in South Africa led to these internal bystanders, people in business, to exert influence on their own government, which contributed significantly, in my view, to the end of apartheid. Not only do bystanders have power to influence, but we as bystanders have great power to influence each other. And I'm going to kind of skip and be more limited in what I say that is on the screen, because otherwise I won't have time to do what I want to do. But I will mention one of my studies. Two people sit in a room. They are working on the same task. One of them is the actual participant in a study. The other one is my confederate working with me. At some point, there is a crash and sounds of distress from another room. And the confederate says one of a variety of different things. She says, that sounds bad, maybe we should do something. Or she says, I don't know what it is, maybe it's another experiment, I don't think it has anything to do with us. Or she says, there were other things also, or she says, that sounds bad, maybe we should do something. I go and find the person in charge, you go into the other room and check what's happening. So the percentage of time when the other person did something ranged from about 25% to 100%. When this other person said, I go and find the person in charge, you go into the room, every single time the other person went to check what's happening. We have powerful potential influence on each other, and we can join together in order to accomplish important goals. This is also true in the real world. At the village of La Chambon, a Huguenot village in the south of France. The villagers hid about 2,000 people. Well, 2,000 is the minimum estimate, maybe more, people to save their lives at the time of the Nazi Holocaust, at time of the Holocaust, the killing of Jews by Nazi Germany, and by various countries that were allied with them. So these people were hiding children, hiding people, and their activities led to some people begin to sympathize with them, and they started to get calls from the local police station telling them that a raid is coming on the village. So when that happened, they moved the people into the forest. But at the end, an officer in charge wanted to destroy the whole village. And the colonel, who was at the trial of a village doctor, who described why he was helping the innocent people that he and the villagers were helping, was so influenced by the words of this village doctor that he persuaded his superior officers not to destroy the village. So there are all kinds of influences that go from one person to another, from one group to another. Now, genocide, great violence against subgroups of society, doesn't just suddenly burst out. There was a commission, a US Commission on the Prevention of Genocide, and they were talking about violence sometimes being volcanic. Like a volcano, it bursts out. But if you really study it and if you look at it, you see how it evolves, how certain things happened that changed people, that led to other things that changed people, and finally it ended in great violence. So because this is the case, it is possible to take action to prevent it. It is possible to predict with some likelihood, significant likelihood, that this is evolving into great violence, and there is a potential to take action. Now, it evolves progressively, partly because individuals and groups change as a result of their own actions. If I harm somebody, if I do some bad thing to a person, for some reason that I have, I wouldn't do a bad thing with no reason, right? I'm doing it with some reason. And then there are no negative consequences to me. I am likely to justify my action. I may have devalued this person before, that made my action possible. Now I devalue this person more. I justify my actions, I find further reasons, and this makes new violence more likely. So there is this evolution. The tragic thing is that for reasons that I will describe, witnesses within a society, bystanders, people who are not members of not actual perpetrators. They are members of the group, perhaps, that perpetrates violence, but they themselves are not perpetrators, and they are not victims. They are witnesses. They are bystanders. They usually remain passive. And this passivity encourages perpetrators. The passivity of a population tells people that at the very least, tells perpetrators that at the very least the population accepts what they are doing, and they often interpret it as approval. And there are further reasons for this. You will see why this is. Now, what happens to the bystanders who don't take action? Here, some people are called very negative words. They are described as morally bad. They are described as enemies. They are given animal names. The Tutsi in Rwanda were called cockroaches. Then there is discrimination against these people. They are not given jobs. They are not allowed to do certain things. There is the beginning of violence, and you are not doing anything. What is likely to happen as you watch this, as you observe this? Well, if you just watch it and take it in, you may feel empathy. You may feel with these suffering others. But if you feel with these suffering others, then you experience distress. Then you are also in pain. So I strongly believe, on the basis of my analysis of many genocides and mass killings, that bystanders beginning to distance themselves from people who are victimized. They are beginning to see the other more and more as the other. They also, like perpetrators, devalue the victims more. They also begin to justify the actions against them. And in the course of that, it becomes less likely that they will take action. Now, when a genocide actually begins, in most societies, there is a very small percentage of people who, at that point, say, this is not right, and begin to help. And usually, in order to help, they have to endanger themselves, because by that time, the perpetrators are totally committed to their course of action and to the elimination of this whole group of people. So they hide people, they do other things to save them. They also evolve. One of the saving graces for us human beings is that it's not only that people who do bad things that change and learn by doing, it's also people who do good things who change and learn by doing. And rescuers often, if they have an opportunity to move people whom they rescued to some other safe place, they go forward and they look for other people to help. Some of the rescuers, actually in one large study of rescuers, about 50% of the rescuers began their rescue activities because they were asked by somebody. Either a person whom they knew from before, a business associate, a neighbor, or someone, or an intermediary. The intermediary could be some important person in the community. So they respond to this request and they decide to help somebody and hide somebody for a few days. And then it becomes a few months. And then some of these people take in more people. And then, as I said, if they can move these people to other places, then they look for more opportunities to help. So there is learning by doing in both directions. What about the victims? Imagine that you live in a society. You have a reasonable life. There may be some discrimination against you. There may be some prejudice against you. But nonetheless, you have neighbors with whom you have relations and you are connected to people. And then this process of increasing devaluation and discrimination and violence against you begins. And your neighbors, who are now witnesses to this, are doing nothing. And people feel abandoned and feel helpless under these conditions, not only because of the power of the perpetrators, but also because of the passivity of the bystanders. In countries where the bystanders were more active, the victims were also more active in their own behalf. So, in particular in Belgium, where a government in exile called on the Belgian population not to go along with the initial actions of the Nazis, not to participate in the confiscation of Jewish property, and so on. And where there were a good number of people who were rescuers, the Jews also were more likely to take action in their own behalf, rescuing others, helping each other, and so on. So when you are a passive bystander, it has a whole variety of different consequences. Bystanders usually are not just passive, because the whole system changes around them. So the Germans, at the time of the Holocaust, became what I call semi-active participants. What do I mean by that? Little things like all of them saying Heil Hitler, to boycotting Jewish stores, to following the directives of the Nazis and stopping relationships with Jews. If you had a Jewish friend, suddenly that person wasn't a friend anymore. Often people separated from spouses. There was only one really known instance of demonstrations against the genocide or the increasing persecution of the Jews and the genocide. And that was when the genocide was in progress, when the deportations of Jews from Germany was in progress. They were taken to Auschwitz and various other death camps. The German wives of Jewish men went in front of government buildings and began to demonstrate. And they went there day after day after day. And you know what happened? The demonstrations of their husbands stopped, and some of those who were already deported were brought back. Now, people say that the reason that they were so effective was that Germany was in the middle of the war, and the government did not want to alienate the German population by turning against German women who were demonstrating for their husbands. But the fact is, we don't know how effective it could have been before if people had taken action, because they had not. In contrast, when the Germans started to kill physically and mentally handicapped and other categories of Germans on the basis of their notions of racial purity to improve the race, once that became known, family members, lawyers groups, Catholic church leaders begin to protest, and the euthanasia program was terminated. First, it was officially terminated, and when a system is already geared up and moving forward, then for some time killings continued, but then they ended. External bystanders were also passive there, and they are passive in other instances. American corporations and other corporations were busy doing business in Germany in the course of the killing of Germans who were seen as enemies of the Nazis and the increasing persecution of Jews. When there was a meeting at Evian of many countries talking about taking in German refugees, and nobody wanted to take in German refugees. The US even didn't take in German refugees whom they could have taken under existing quotas that already approved by Congress. Goebbels, the German propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, they would all like to do the Jews what we are doing, but they don't have the courage. Again, as I said, perpetrators feel affirmed by the passivity and inaction of bystanders. I mean, the same things are true in relation to Turkey, the genocide of the Armenians in Turkey, the same things are true in relation to Rwanda. The outsiders, even though they had information before, and when the genocide began, remained passive. We could talk about why bystanders remain passive, and there are a lot of reasons. Genocide, an instigating condition for genocide, there are two primary starting points in my view. One of them is what I call difficult life conditions, economic deterioration, very great social changes, political confusion and disorganization, and these all have profound impacts on people. The impact is not only economic. The impact is not only that people don't have enough food or their housing is endangered. The impact is also very much psychological. Even when there is not as great an economic impact, the psychological impact is great. Under such conditions, whether it is group conflict or difficult life conditions, people feel insecure. And we all have a need for security. People feel ineffective. They cannot influence events in their lives. And we all have a need for effectiveness. people feel diminished because they cannot care for themselves and their families. And we all have a need for a positive identity, and so on. People have a need for understanding the world and their own place in it. And under these conditions, everything changes. And their traditional old comprehension of the world doesn't work. So they look for new understanding of the world. And they need their group. They shift their identity. Rather than thinking of themselves as Joe Schmo, they become more a group member because the group gives them more of an identity. Because when the group scapegoats another group, that makes them feel it's not my fault what's happening, it is somebody else's fault. When the group creates a vision of how to improve the situation of the group, even if they identify enemies, saying the reason we cannot create this better world for ourselves is because of this other group. They are part of that process, and it empowers them. Oh, if it is this other group, then we can take action to improve our situation by acting against this other group. And given all this, given people's need for their group, given the difficulty in difficult times to resist their group, to oppose what the group is doing, and given what I call this cultural tilt, that usually people have learned before already to devalue the group that becomes the scapegoat and the ideological enemy, they remain passive. There is more actually also, because there are various inhibitors. We know this from experimental research in emergency situations and other kind of situations where there is a need for action. We know that there are various inhibitors of action. One of them is diffusion of responsibility. Why am I responsible? Just little me. There is this whole thing going on in the society, and here I am. Why am I responsible? Another thing that inhibits helping is pluralistic ignorance. There is a dominant voice of the government or of the people who are perpetrating harm or who are moving the society towards that. And you don't hear voices that say, these people are in need, we must take action. So if one person doesn't speak, even in a real situation when somebody is lying on the ground, you look around, and if everybody looks unconcerned, you think, oh, well, there is no reason for concern. Maybe that person is just drunk and sleeping it off. So the more there are voices out there, the more people are activated. And in a situation like that, especially with an authoritarian government, there are no voices. So that's another inhibitor. To be aware of this, to understand these inhibitors, to understand that the silence of other people doesn't mean that there is no need for action, is very important in making each of us feel some responsibility to act. Why are external parties passive? Well, sometimes they don't act out of historical connections and misplaced loyalties. But the Russians didn't want to do anything when there was violence in Bosnia because the Serbs were the perpetrators and they had a historical relationship to the Serbs and they didn't want to do anything. Business interests, as I described before, corporations doing business there. When there was the violence in Bosnia, and people were killed in Sarajevo, people were shot at from neighboring hills and killed in Sarajevo. I had a conversation with a member of the US National Security Council. And I said, why doesn't President Clinton do something? I mean, this is a really bad situation. And he said, President Clinton cannot do anything because people in Podunk, meaning out in the country, wherever, wouldn't support it. So the history is that before that, we were trying to be helpful in Somalia. Some of our soldiers were killed. Clinton was afraid of political repercussions, so he didn't do anything for a long time. The most powerful man in the world, supposedly, feels powerless to do anything because he thinks that people wouldn't support it, which is actually not the case. If a president pointed to the need of people and expressed eloquently, as Clinton is capable of doing, of the need of the people whom we want to help, I think that he would get a lot of support. But people relinquish responsibility even in positions of high authority. So I'm going to go on a little bit about generating active bystandership. First of all, it's a matter for us as individuals to care about other people, but not only people within our own group, but also people outside our group and all human beings. You know, parents, most parents, not all parents, but most parents at least have the intention to raise children who care about the welfare of some people. People in their families, people who are of the same religion, people in their community, whatever. But we very often draw lines of where that caring needs to stop, where that caring ought to stop. We teach children in so many ways, you know, little ways. You walk out down the street with your child, holding your child's hand, and there is somebody lying on the ground on a cold night, and the child wants to approach that somebody, and you pull the child away and continue walking. You think nothing happened, but a very important thing happened. We teach children non-verbally, we teach children verbally to not care about certain kinds of other people, and especially people whom our society values. So warmth, affection, teaches children that there is caring in the world. Positive guidance in terms of values teaches them that it is part of their responsibility to help others. Learning by doing is very important. Getting children to be engaged in activities that help others. I did a series of studies once upon a time, getting children to make toys for poor hospitalized children, or making toys, or older children teaching something younger children. And when children engaged in these activities, they were later more helpful. Learning by doing. The learning by doing needs to include helping people who are usually seen as the other, so that we develop inclusive caring. And moral courage is also a necessity, because often, in order to help people who are endangered, you have to oppose your group, which is doing the endangering. How do you teach moral courage? Well, we don't really know from research, because there is no real research on it. But I think that one starting point, an important element, is to give children a voice. So, in a classroom, allowing and encouraging children to participate in developing rules for the class. How do we live together as a community, as a classroom? In the home, the same thing. Not discouraging children to express their values in action when that may have some limited consequence. How many parents really tell their child, you know, if somebody in your classroom is picked on, you really should do something. You should speak up. And of course, if the parent is smart and has studied the research relevant to this, then the parent would say, well, you know, one thing that you can do is that you turn to other witnesses or bystanders and say to them something like, shouldn't we do something? And so you recruit allies, and then you together take action. But the point is that parents often discourage their children, I think, to take action that in some way might bring negative consequences to the child. And that is not the way to teach moral courage. A really important thing is for us to, as Americans, most of you in this room are probably American citizens, right? And a really important thing for us as Americans is to exert influence on our government, to create a system that leads to early action when there are indications that there is a danger of significant danger of violence against a group of people in some other place. And I'm talking about early actions because if you don't take early action, then the alternative is to use military force later on. And that is costly, that is politically problematic. It requires more moral courage on the part of our leaders and more this mysterious thing that people call political will. But early action does not require this. It can be engagement with a government and a group that begins to persecute its people. It can be outsiders taking actions that initiate positive action by internal actors. But we don't have such a system in place. Even today, after remaining passive in Rwanda, by the way, you know, the reason that Clinton later took action in Bosnia and initiated action by NATO was most likely seeing the horrendous consequences of not taking action in Rwanda. We were totally passive. We didn't do anything. We refused to call it a genocide. We even interfered with the international community trying to do something because we didn't want to have to be involved. And when the consequences of this were seen, something like 800,000 people killed, then Clinton, who I do think has a moral core, initiated action in Bosnia. It shouldn't have to be that way. So we need to work on influencing our government to take on the responsibility. We are the greatest power on earth. If we provide moral leadership, other countries will follow us. So it is very important to do this. There are only a smatterings of the beginning of this, creating such a system, but only the beginning, and there is not anything near enough. There is violence going on in Darfur against people in Darfur. There is a lot of violence in the Congo. Something like over 6 million people have died there over a period of time, and the violence is continuing. There is violence in the Sudan. There are large numbers of people who are in the danger of starvation because the Sudanese government doesn't allow food to come in, and so on. And we are not doing things. So we need to create a system, and we need to act on our conscience. So I think I do want to talk about this. You know, I was talking briefly about the roots of caring, and I was describing the positive roots of caring. Warmth, affection, love, good values, parents insisting that children act on those values, and learning by doing, getting children involved in action, getting children participate in decision making, allow them to have a voice. But a lot of people don't have those circumstances, and many people in the world suffer a great deal. In 1989, the magazine Psychology Today asked me to develop a questionnaire for them about altruism. So I developed a questionnaire on values and helping. And 7,000 people returned that questionnaire, more than 7,000. And a lot of people, in response to my request, also sent letters saying some things about themselves. And there were a number of these letters that said, I help people, and I want to help people because I suffered, and I don't want other people to suffer the way I have. And so I began to think about how it's not only that caring and helping has positive roots, but that one's own suffering under certain circumstances can give rise to caring about other people. In light of one's suffering, to open one's heart and feel empathy for others, and try to help, and feel a personal responsibility to help others, and try to help people. And there are certain experiences, I believe, that are important for this. Some of these things are experiences that happen at the time of suffering. If other people help you in some ways, when you suffer, that tells you that the world doesn't have to be like the perpetrators of your suffering make it to be. That it can be a caring world. If you can in some way help yourself, not necessarily eliminate your suffering, but still help yourself to some degree, that empowers you and says, I can take action in my own behalf, and so I can take action in others' behalf. If people after bad experiences support you, help you, embrace you, that makes a very big difference. Now, trauma psychologists say that trauma is a function both of traumatic events and what happens afterwards. So there are a whole variety of experiences that I think can lead people who have suffered themselves to become caring and helpful. And I think this is extremely important. You know, I also want to say that, so when you help somebody who is being harmed in some way, you are not only stopping that harm right then or diminishing that harm, you are also making it more likely that this person, herself or himself, becomes someone who then later helps other people. Let me see if there is anything. I just, you know, another example of a single person making a tremendous difference, the Genocide Convention. Ralph Lemkin, a lawyer, Polish by origin, who managed to escape the Nazis and lived in New York and in the United States, was extremely instrumental in creating the Genocide Convention, which the UN adopted and is now part of our universal experience and awareness. So a single person also has to gain allies. Ralph Lemkin was very good in getting allies, in getting other people to join him, and so he managed to accomplish this. I want to finish with a couple minutes of talking about our work in Rwanda, Burundi, and the Congo. You know, when there is great violence between groups, if there is no reconciliation between the groups, it's very likely that there will be new violence. So reconciliation is important. What is reconciliation? Doing things that lead groups towards accepting each other, having more positive views of each other, developing also structures and systems that make shared life possible. So we went to Rwanda and started to do workshops and trainings for people, first talking about the origins of violence, because that's what they asked us to do. How does genocide begin? And by that time, I have been working on this for many years, and so we were talking about the origins of genocide and what's the impact of violence on people. And we evaluated the effects of this, and the effects not on the people we trained, but on the people they later worked with, was that Hutus and Tutsis had more positive attitudes towards each other. and they had lower trauma symptoms. And there were other positive effects. And then we did these trainings with national leaders. We did these trainings with media and other people. And then we decided to create educational radio programs. I will just mention one of this, is a radio drama in Rwanda that began to broadcast in 2004. It's a story of two villages in conflict. There was a piece of fertile land between them that the authorities gave to one of the villages. There is a drought. The other village is hungry. There is also animosity between somebody in that village and family in the other village, and this person begins to initiate hostile actions, and so there is attacks and counterattacks, Romeo-Juliet type love story between people in the two villages, and slowly over time the villages move towards reconciliation. And the evaluations, the early evaluations of this radio drama show that it has, again, a whole variety of positive effects. It makes a difference. And this radio drama is listened to by approximately 88% of all the population of Rwanda. So the potential for this to have an influence is quite substantial. People who have listened to the radio drama early on in the evaluation study are more likely to go out and engage in reconciliation activities with other people, actually approaching somebody who harmed their family or approaching somebody whom they harmed. Well, I'm going to stop there. If you are interested in some relevant articles and book chapters, you can find it on my website, www.ervinstaub.com. Thank you very much. It's nice to talk to you. Research shows that in athletic teams where there are white and African American students on the same team, there's less prejudice. When people realized that after integration of schools in the United States, white and African American minority kids did not interact very much. They hung out separately and they maintained negative attitudes towards each other. As an experimental procedure, they introduced cooperative learning techniques. So one of them, for example, is called the jigsaw technique, where 6 kids are put together into a group. This is a mixed group. And in order to accomplish their task, each of the kids has to learn something and teach it to the other kids. So each child is a learner and a teacher of others. And evaluation shows that this substantially affected attitudes towards the other group, substantially affected the degree to which kids begin to engage with each other. It also improved the academic learning of minority students, and it didn't diminish the academic learning of white students. There are a lot of examples of people in the Ivory Coast. Grants were given to local farmers to create cooperative projects, collaborative projects across group lines. The grant depended on this cooperation. When violence flared up in the region, people involved in this, in those communities, there was no violence. So there's a lot of example that really working together makes a difference. Yes, let me come around there. You know, this is such a great question because it is such a challenging question. It is a really difficult question. I mean, let's go to the extreme. There is a flood, and your children are drowning, and the neighbor's children are drowning. This is the sort of question, right? Of course, you were asking about countries. And You know, the thing is that given who we are, given our nature, given our experience, we cannot expect not to have more connection and more of a feeling of commitment to people like us, people whom we are related to. So in the extreme, and I'm talking about extreme now, you would save your own child, I would assume, and that would be morally acceptable before, if you have a chance, try to save the other child. But there is another problem here, and that's the problem of judgment. When you look at group relations and you say, let's look and take care of ourselves first, well, how do we judge the relative need, the degree of need? So we have a lot of poor people in this country, but there are a lot of people being killed in other countries. So are we going to take care of our poor first before we pay attention to other people being killed in large numbers at some other place? And I would say it's not the same thing. A certain level of poverty versus the horror of being chosen to be killed and being helpless and nobody coming to help you and support you. So this has to be, these are very important moral questions and moral judgments involved. But we have to be aware of our tendency to be prejudiced in favor of ourselves and making judgments in light of which then we feel, well, of course, I cannot do that because I have to do this at home. Does this make sense? Anything else? Yes.
Do you think that people who are likely to help, like single individuals, that will help? Is it more a situation on them, or is it more of a personality?
Another great question. See, I think that our behavior is a function of our personality, which includes our values, our beliefs, the orientations that we develop to other people, including people in other groups. That's part of all who we are. Our immediate situation, the people around us, somebody telling me, oh, forget it, let's go to the movies. Or somebody telling me, well, you are part of us. You have to support the group. Or somebody's telling me something else. So the immediate circumstances and the larger social situation. The larger situation includes economic decline and being affected by it, both materially and psychologically. So all of these things come together. And I think one of the things that is really important for us is to be aware of these things. I mean, I'm sorry to take more time in answering this question, but I have something that I developed a long time ago that I call personal goal theory, meaning that we all have certain values that identify certain goals. So I have certain pro-social values, and it makes it a goal for me to help other people, and so on. These values we can arrange in a hierarchy. What is important for me, more important and less important for me. And if you sit me down at a table, I can write down what is more and less important for me. But when I am in an actual situation, the situation calls on certain values and goals and can elevate that value and goal in the hierarchy so that I may ignore my most important value, all other things equal, because of the influence of this particular situation. I have a conscience. I really believe that people in other countries should be helped, and I'm a member of the president's cabinet, and the whole direction of the conversation is that we need to attend to our own concerns because that is too much effort and too much cost to try to go and help those other people. And this may not be so explicit because people might be too ashamed to make it quite that explicit. And so this influences me greatly. So to be aware of what are the influences that may move me towards one kind of action or the other is very important. Because then I may be able to resist the influence of some situations, and I may be more likely to act on my conscience, or my top values, or my most important values. Yes.
Staub, I think it's very interesting that the age that we live in today, social networking, everyone knows or can know what's happening on the other side of the globe. When I think about Nazi Germany, I think one of the ways that they were so successful in that genocide because of their ability to keep things under wraps. So for a long period of time, people could say, we didn't know the extent, we didn't know what was happening. Today, when we are able to know, people are being killed in Syria, for example. You mentioned the trouble spots in the Congo. Still very difficult to feel empowered to do anything. After all, I'm just a little person.
Exactly.
What can I do to make a difference?
Exactly. Absolutely right. But let me just say something. I will say something about that, but let me say something about people knowing and not knowing. You know, I think that when the overwhelming social forces make it very difficult for you to act, there is probably a tendency on the part of many people to make themselves not know. So people in Nazi Germany probably knew quite a bit more in all kinds of ways than they later acknowledged. And you know, some researchers, and you probably know this, you know, looked at letters coming back from the front where soldiers, not only special troops that were specially designated to kill Jews behind the German lines, but also soldiers were drawn in to this. And they wrote back letters home, and they wrote about these things. So I think people knew a fair amount, but the overwhelming influence of the situation was that it would have been very difficult to really allow themselves to know. And so not only did they not acknowledge to others, but they may have suppressed it within themselves. But yes, the question, what do I do as one little person? Now, as I said in one of the classes I visited, if you are in a certain position, like you have spent your life studying these things, then I and my partner, Lori Perlman, a trauma specialist, could decide on our own to go to Rwanda and try to work on reconciliation. And she was talking about us from the very beginning as two little peanuts going to Rwanda to trying to do something and make a difference. But if you don't have that kind of specialty, and that's not how you spend your life, what can you do? Let me just say that the very act of trying affirms you as a moral being. You can talk to your neighbors. You can try to get many people to write letters to the editor. What's the point? They are not going to publish it. I think that one of the points is that if enough people write letters to the editor, to a newspaper, they are going to begin to think about the issue that you are writing about. They begin to realize that there is an audience there for this matter, and they may cover that particular element of news more. You can join, there are a lot of organizations engaged with these things. And right now, some genocide prevention-related organizations are dissolving because there aren't enough people interested and concerned with it. So you can join such organizations, and if enough people join such organizations, then things can happen. You can initiate something in any kind of civic group that you are part of. If you are, not now, but a little later, or maybe now some of you, part of Chamber of Commerce, you begin to try to get that Chamber of Commerce to do something. And you may not stand up and announce that I want this Chamber of Commerce. You may talk to people individually, because by gathering allies, you make a difference. I have been a member and the chair of a number of nominating committees for officers in organizations. When one person says, I would like to nominate such and such, and nobody seconds it, and nobody speaks in behalf of it, it dies. When there is one single other person who says something, the thing moves forward. So you need to work with people and talk to them and create connections. So you can do this in your churches. You can get your church to invite other churches. I mean, again, in one of the classes, I mentioned that there was this woman in Liberia where there was incredible violence in the country. And this woman gathered women of her own church and told them, we must do something. And they went out and invited women for other churches. And then they went to demonstrate in large numbers. And this moved things toward the peace process. And when there were negotiations at the top, and they were going to stop without coming to any kind of agreement, they went there and essentially blocked people from leaving and said, you cannot leave until you come to an agreement. And it worked. So there are many things that people can do. And you have to be willing to act and continue to act as part of your life. I'm not asking and I'm not suggesting that all of you give up your lives and all of you become active bystanders on behalf of these causes. Some of you may, and that's very good. But some of you want to live normal lives, and it can become part of your normal life and normal activities. And even when there is no direct, immediate, observable progress, what you are doing can make a difference. But it is a difficult world, and especially here in the United States, there is such a cacophony of voices. So many voices, so many blogs, so many editorials, so many points of views, so many perspectives. How does one, a little person like any one of us, move a system like this? It's very difficult and it's very challenging, and still people do it. People sometimes do it. Things do change. Yes.
This question is based on a kind of an anecdote of one person's recollection, but I have a close friend whose mother was born in Germany, and she was a very young child in a Christian family during the war. And what she reports is her memory is that families were very afraid to kind of talk to other people because they might be reported for being disloyal, and so people really kept quiet. I was wondering if you could speak to how this kind of fear and this paranoia might both inhibit bystandership, and what might you do to resist that?
Well, the Germans did a good job at this. They recruited children, children who were part of the Hitler Youth or Hitler Jugend to spy on their own parents. And not all of them did, of course, but some of them did. And so not only were they afraid of neighbors, they could be afraid of their own children. I mean, imagine what that is like. So it is true. And still those women went out as women. They were able to contact each other and get in touch with each other, engage with each other, and go out and demonstrate there, and having an effect. And people who demonstrated against the euthanasia program had an effect. So I gather that in a situation like that, you have to have not only moral courage, but physical courage. And you have to be very careful who you talk to. And you cannot be sure. But that's part of what courage is about. It's a very challenging situation when a system is set up where everybody spies on everybody else and the authorities are highly repressive. But in this country, we don't do a lot of things. And at this point, at least, we are not in danger when we try to advocate for our country to do certain kinds of things. So that is important, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that for all these things, the diffusion of responsibility. What can I do as a person? The pluralistic ignorance, the costs involved, the time involved. We are all busy within our own affairs, right? I mean, I have books to write. I have talks to give. I have Rwanda to go to where I can do some important things. So a lot of other important things go by the wayside. It's inevitable that we cannot do everything. But sometimes people ask me, when I give talks and talk about bystanders, in this world where there is so much need, what do I respond to? And I tend to say that you do two things. One is You choose something that is close to your heart, and you act on that particular thing. And the other one is you respond to great emergencies. Now, the trouble, of course, is that we have more and more great emergencies. And nonetheless, we need to respond to great emergencies. The Congo, Sudan, Darfur, these are some of the live things right now. Yes, Syria is also a live thing, but it's very difficult to know what to do about Syria. That's really a very challenging thing. But in certain realms, we do know. We could exert influence on our government to help contribute to the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. A very important issue, I believe. It's important for Israel, it's important for the Palestinians, it's important for the region, and Obama did a little something, and then that was it, and nothing has been happening, and it's something that festers. So there are these really important issues in the world, and at least some of them, if you can engage with, it can make a difference.